Well, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us in this study today. Appreciate all of your prayers during the time when my dad was going through his medical issues. Went through his surgery, was in the hospital a week, and he is home now and doing much, much better. But at 88 years of age, his recovery time is somewhat slower than he would like. So we're still taking care of him and just continuing to pray for him for strength. So again, thank you for your support and understanding in all of this. Well, we are going back into Judges chapter 8, and I know it's been a couple weeks since we looked at chapter 7 and had a session on it, but as a quick recap, this is Gideon, who has been chosen as a deliverer or otherwise known as a judge of Israel. And he had some fears and he put out the wool's fleece. And one time it became wet and the other time it became dry. And he gained his, confidence that God was with him. He also had an encounter where he met an angelic being or a theophany of visible form of God. I'm not quite sure which one. And all of these things to give him confidence. And so then he went and took 300 men. Remember, they had the water drinking test at the river, and many failed, and 300 survived that test. And then he armed them with a trumpet and with a pitcher that held a lamp on the inside. And so they went into the camp, broke their pitchers, the lights shone forth, they blew the trumpets. God worked a miracle by putting the Midianites all in disarray, and they started killing each other and trampling over each other and scurrying out of the way. And so that's where we left this. And um, as we left chapter 7, I mentioned that there was a little bit of a spoiler alert to look for the verse in verse 24 where the Ephraimites were called by Gideon to help in kind of the cleanup, the aftermath, to finish the loose ends and help defeat the enemy. And so this is where we pick up with the suspense of chapter 8, because the men of Ephraim came to him and said, "Well, why'd you do this to us?" Verse 1, "Why didn't you call us when you went in to fight with Midian?" And they were chiding them sharply. You just got to love the King's English here, chiding with them sharply, meaning they had a strong disagreement and they were at each other. And here is where this gets really interesting, because you read through verse 2, and I'll read it for you, and it just kind of goes over our heads. We don't grasp the meaning of this cliche or metaphor. Gideon responds and says unto them, "What have I done in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Ebiezer?" And so that we would just gloss over that in it because it just makes no sense or resonance to us. But I have a copy of a Hebrew Bible. I don't know if you can see it. One side's in Hebrew, one side's in English, and it would be what they study in the synagogue. And there's commentary on there from Jewish sages over these millennium, and they shed a lot of light on this. And I'm going to read it to you because it is fascinating, and I don't want to miss any part of it. But they point out that Ephraim was the most powerful tribe in the north, and they were resentful of this usurpation of a lesser tribe in their area. So Gideon, knew he wasn't as strong, and so Gideon is playing this peacemaker in between here, and that's brought out by the Jewish sages. So, of course, the Ephraimites said, "Why have you done this to us?" which illustrates petty jealousies. But Gideon's reply, as I'm quoting here, illustrates the proverb that a soft answer turneth away wrath. So he starts out what he says, "What have I done in comparison to you?" So he's trying to build them up and acknowledge that the Ephraimites are much bigger, much more powerful, more warlike, got all the right tools, all the right tanks and missile launchers and everything. And, Gideon's army's just nothing compared to them. And then this next little phrase here, he asserts that gleanings are the second pickings of the grapes. So when you go through and pick grapes for the first time, that's called the vintage, ascribed to the vintage, where you pick all the primo grapes, the ones that aren't fallen on the ground, the ones that aren't overripe, they're just the right ripeness. This is the vintage of the pickings, but the gleanings are the second passes through. And so what he's saying is that um, the part played by Ephraim, even though less spectacular than the initial victory of Abiezer, was decisive in importance in the ultimate success of the campaign. Um, this was Gideon's compliment to them, and so he is trying to assuage them, trying to get the tone down, and so he's being the peacemaker here. And you'll see that this phrase, as Gideon describes, that God delivered into your hands these Midianites, Oreb and Zeb, and he says, "What am I able to do in comparison to you?" And that was enough to abate their anger in verse 3, and everything was peaceful and taken care of again. Where it gets really interesting here is what happens after this. You would think that the Ephraimites would be joining with him, but we see in verse 4 that they seem to have not joined in, feeling that their pride was satisfied. And now Gideon is coming and passing over Jordan, and he's still got these 300 guys with them. But of course, they've been up all night. They've been fighting. Again, how exhausted they were. The word here is translated faint, but it really means exhaustion. And there are 300 men who are still with him and wanting to fight the remnant that's left. And we're going to find out that there are 15,000 men left. So picture this battle plan: 300 following 15,000. 15,000 is the word I meant to say, not 1,500, but 15,000 men. Still a very lopsided battle plan. And so as he's pursuing them, he runs into these people and the men of Succoth and asks for some food. Give us some loaves of bread. He explains, we're chasing after these guys, Zebah and Zalmunna and the kings of Midian, and we're tired. Give us some bread, and we can continue our routing of them. Now, again, thinking of what we see here, 15,000 enemy against 300 of Gideon's men, this is not a for sure thing. But yet, I believe through the experience that Gideon had with the Lord and the promises that the Lord had given him, plus what he and these 300 men saw in the initial battle, had to have filled them with so much confidence that they didn't care what kind of armament they had. They didn't care how well they were outfitted. They didn't care what the battle plan was or what was going to happen. They were so filled with confidence that God was going to deliver them because they had seen um, the men die before. And we're going to look ahead and just see how many there were that had been conquered in this first battle. Um, but again, here's Gideon going by himself, comes to the men of Succoth, and it's a very interesting interaction here, trying hard to really understand why this was even needed to be put here. But we'll go through it and then talk about it afterwards. And verse 6 says, the princes of Succoth said, well, okay, your victory isn't sure. They saw the odds 300 versus 15,000. Who am I going to choose? I don't know that I'm going to give everything to 300 men. I'm going to align myself and stay on the side of might makes right, that 15,000 are probably going to wipe out the 300. And when these 15,000 come back victorious, I don't want to be the next ones they're going to wipe out because I helped these 300. So I can see where the princes of Sukkoth made this statement in verse 6. And Gideon, look at his response. He's just filled with an understanding of who's fighting the battle. And he says, therefore, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, here we go, I will tear the flesh off your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Um, this is indicative of how um, relationships and battle plans went over at that time. You'll find it alluded to by King David many times, that when a conquering army would come in, and the king who's controlling it would overtake another kingdom. The king would get a hook pulled through his jaw on a rope, and he would be dragged behind the horses or the mules or the camels or whatever they were doing, and that would be kind of the victory lap of the conquering king, is to put a hook through and drag this guy, the losing king, through until he died. So this is what Gideon's alluding to here, is when he comes back, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hook you through the jaw with a hook, tie you to my camel or horse or donkey, and I'm going to pull you through the wilderness, and you will be ripped apart from the thorns and the briars. Um, Again, I can't even think in these terms. My mind in this century of civility and all the right. Even you see it now, what's going on in the Ukraine, you see the brutality that is accused of the Russians, and there are the rules of engagement, the rules of war, of inhumane versus humane treatment. None of that existed back at this time, and so I want to fault Gideon here, saying, "Well, how can you do that? You're supposed to be man sent by God, and here." You're going to do something just horrible to these people. Killing is one thing, but torturing of this type is just unthinkable for me. But I have to remember that this is a different time. This is a different culture. This is not Western culture. This is Middle Eastern culture, and it's you know 3, 4,000 years ago, when times were very, very different. And so that's how I'm going to process it and package it and put it in that little box of understanding here. So just taking one more look at the map again to see where we are in the scheme of things. I'm going to circle around Gideon here being up by Ophrah, not the talk show host, but a city in Issachar. And I tried looking and saying, where did the Midianites come from? Ephraim is down here below in this mauve color. They're quite a ways away from where Gideon was, but I don't even see any um, nations labeled as Midianites. We see the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, Philistines, Amalekites, Jebusites, and Amorites down there, but the Midianites must be out here in the right-hand side. And so that means to get to where Gideon was, they would have had to pass through East Manasseh and probably through parts of Gad. And I don't know if this was just an area where no one lived and they could go through without encountering anybody from these other tribes. A little bit of a mystery to me, but we know this is the area it happened, because this river flowing north to south here from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea is the Jordan River, and we'll see that that is referenced in here quite often by Gideon. So it says they left that city of Sukkoth. Then they went to the next city of Penuel and spoke to those guys. Now, these were cities, they were fortified, they had princes, they had a king, but they probably didn't have a lot of inhabitants to it. Um, they were small little kingdoms of areas of protection, because remember, there were really nobody to protect you. There was no national army, no national guard. You protected yourself and walled yourself in. So here was another city that said, "Nope, we're not giving you anything to eat." And Gideon responds in verse 9, "Well, when I come again, I'm going to break down this tower," you know, threatening his wrath against them. Now, verse 10 says they continued on and they encountered these 15,000 men, which is where we get the idea of how many there were. But it doesn't say that they got any food. The men were faint, they were hungry. Somewhere they had to have gotten food, or they would not have been able to fight the enemy. So again, the people who maybe gave them food didn't make the verses here because they were kind to them. Only the ones that were inhospitable and unkind to them made the verses here, and we'll see the wrath come upon them at another time. And verse 10 closes out as where we're going as far we're going today, that during this initial battle that we read in chapter 7, it says that the amount of Midianites and the armies that were there were innumerable. They couldn't number them. There were just too many to count. But here in verse 10, we get an understanding that there were 120,000 men that died, that drew the sword, that were destroyed by Gideon's army. And of course, it was God's hand turning against them. But this even puts that whole battle in a different perspective of 300 men with trumpets and pitchers, and there fell 120,000 men that drew the sword, that were armed against 300 men that were unarmed. So, what did Gideon and his 300 men see that enabled them to have a boldness, to have a confidence, to see God working? I mean, obviously, they saw something. They saw these 120,000 men died in some fashion that Gideon and his 300 men witnessed, that they knew it was a miracle from God. And it emboldened them, it strengthened them, and that it allowed them to go and pursue 15,000 men, feeling that they were still going to win because of what God had done. And to me, there's just a nugget of encouragement, a nugget of a lesson inside of there, that God tells us that it doesn't matter what the extenuating circumstances look like. It doesn't matter the size of the army. God, when He's in the picture, when we are in His will, doing what He wants us to be, it doesn't matter how many there are. 120,000, it could have been 400,000, could have been a million against 300. Those type of odds mean nothing to God when we are in His will, and He has a will that He wants to accomplish. So Gideon is empowered and emboldened, and I believe that's maybe a lesson for us too, is to think about Gideon. Think about that he had fear, but yet God was merciful to him while he created a confidence and a trust in Gideon for what God was going to do. God came through in ways that Gideon probably couldn't even imagine, but he saw what God had done, and it gave him the strength and the encouragement to go on. So we're going to stop here at verse 10. We're going to pick up next week and look at what happened with this battle. We're going to look what happened when he came back to these two cities, and God's name and power will be for sure magnified in all of this. So, all right, thanks again. God bless all of you, and we will look forward to seeing you next week.